Life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor turned spy who took on the Third Reich with nothing but a Bible, briefcase, and cojones the size of Bavaria. This isn't your grandma's church history lesson. It's a tale of faith, resistance, and espionage that would make for a good James Bond movie. So grab your secret decoder rings and prepare to meet the man who brought new meaning to the phrase, the cost of discipleship. Our story begins in the twilight of the German Empire on February 4th, 1906 in what is now Poland. So imagine a world of kaisers and empires where the sun never seemed to set on European dominion. And into this world of privilege and prestige, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born. He was the sixth of 8 children in a family so upper crust they made the Von Trapps look like the Beverly Hillbillies. His dad was a big shot psychiatrist and neurologist, while his mom came from blue-blooded Prussian stock. It's the kind of family where you're expecting the kids to grow up to be bankers, lawyers, maybe if they're feeling rebellious, a doctor. But Dietrich, he had other plans. At the age of 14, he dropped a bombshell in his family. I'm gonna be a theologian. It was like he was announcing, I'm gonna study art in college. It's just not what you're expecting from a Bonhoeffer. But here's where the plot thickens. Young Dietrich wasn't just interested in dusty old books and arcane debates about how many angels can dance on the pin of a head. No, he wanted something more. He wanted to know, what does it really mean to follow Christ in the modern world? And little did he know, he was about to get more modern world than he actually bargained for. And Bonhoeffer tore through his theological studies quicker than you can say consubstantiation. By 21, he had a doctorate in theology from the University of Berlin. He was the theological version of Doogie Howser, MD. Brilliant, precocious, and making the rest of us feel like underachievers. But he wasn't content to just sit in an ivory tower and ponder and pontificate on the mysteries of the universe while the world around him burned. No, he had a restless spirit that wouldn't let him settle for academic accolades alone. So, like any good millennial, before millennials were even a thing, he decided to go find himself. And where else would you go but America? So in 1930, he heads to Union Theological Seminary in New York. Now, you might think a stuffy German academic would stick out like a sore thumb in the Big Apple, but Bonhoeffer was full of surprises. He dove into the Harlem Renaissance. He soaked up African-American spirituals. He preached in black churches. It was sort of like watching a lederhosen-clad tourist discover jazz. Unexpected, but somehow it kind of worked. But it wasn't all jazz and sermons. Bonhoeffer also got his first taste of the social gospel movement, which emphasized putting faith into action for social justice. And this would shape his theology and his writings. And so back in Germany, Bonhoeffer decides it's time to put this fancy education to use. And so he becomes a lecturer at the University of Berlin. But he also took a role as a pastor. He was trying to keep one foot in the ivory tower, but the other foot in the real world. But here's where our story takes a dark turn. Because while Bonhoeffer was busy trying to figure out how to be both a scholar and a pastor, a madman was rising to power in Germany. Enter stage right, Adolf Hitler. Now, you might be thinking that the appearance of a fascist dictator would be enough to make anyone run for the hills. But Bonhoeffer, he saw it as a call to action. It was like he looked at the rise of Nazism and thought, this might be a perfect opportunity to test out my theology in real-world conditions. And so as Hitler tightened his grip on Germany, many churches, they rolled over faster than a Dachshund looking for a belly rub. But not Bonhoeffer. He was a part of the confessing church. And it was a movement that stood against the Nazi-aligned German Christians. Bonhoeffer, he didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. He helped establish an underground seminary to train pastors in the confessing way. Logical speakeasy where instead of bootleg gin, they were smuggling in uncut doses of biblical truth. It was like Hogwarts for rebellious pastors, and Bonhoeffer was Dumbledore. But the Nazis weren't about to let this theological troublemaker off easy. And so in 1937, they shut down the seminary and they begin to arrest confessing church pastors. And so Bonhoeffer, he finds himself in a bit of a pickle. If he stays, he'll face arrest. Should he flee to safety? In 1939, war looming on the horizon, his friends arranged for him to take a teaching position at Union Theological Seminary in New York. It's like the theological version of the witness protection program, safe, secure, and he's far from any Nazi threat. But here's where Bonhoeffer's story, it takes another unexpected turn. He's only in the States for about a month, but something's just kind of churning inside him. He decides to go back to Germany. That's right, voluntarily, he returns to Nazi Germany. And it was like watching someone walk out of a cushy job to enter the unknown. And his reasoning is that I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I don't share the trials of this time with my people. And cue the collective from his American friends, who probably thought he lost his marbles. So back in Germany, Bonhoeffer then faces a moral dilemma that would make even the most seasoned ethicists break out in a cold sweat. He was a pacifist, which means he believed in nonviolence. But as a Christian, he felt a duty to oppose the Nazi regime. But as a Christian, he felt a duty to oppose the Nazi regime. It was like trying to square a circle. It feels impossible. Bonhoeffer was determined to make it work. So his solution was to join the German Military Intelligence Agency. And it turns out this was a hotbed for anti-Nazi resistance. So what's Bonhoeffer's role? He was to use his ecumenical, meaning pastoral contacts, to gather intelligence and seek Allied support for the German resistance. It was like he stepped out of a theological textbook and into a James Bond novel. But there's more. He wasn't just passing along information. He was involved in plots to assassinate Hitler. Yeah, the pacifist pastor was trying to take out the Führer. It's like watching Mr. Rogers join the Navy SEALs. It's unexpected, to say the least. And this period of Bonhoeffer's life, it raises some of the most intriguing ethical questions. Like, how does a man of peace justify involvement in assassination plots? And how does he balance the commandment, thou shalt not kill, with the moral imperative to stop a genocidal dictator? And for Bonhoeffer, these weren't academic exercises. They are life and death decisions that would ultimately shape his legacy for decades to come. In April 1943, the Gestapo finally caught up with Bonhoeffer. They arrested him for his involvement in helping Jews escape to Switzerland. It's a plot known as Operation 7. And it was sort of like a biblical exodus, but with more lederhosen and Ku Klux Klans. And Bonhoeffer then spends the next 2 years in a variety of prisons and concentration camps. But even behind bars, his mind was free. He wrote letters and papers that would later be published as Letters and Papers from Prison. It is a theological classic. I wonder if anyone else wrote some of their best work from prison. And in these writings, Bonhoeffer grappled with what does it mean to be Christian in a world that had come of age. A world that thought they don't need God as a hypothesis to explain natural phenomenon. It was like he was trying to reinvent Christianity for a post-Christian world, all while sitting inside a Nazi prison cell. And as the war drew to a close and the Allied forces closed in, the Nazi regime decided to tie up loose ends. And in April 1945, just weeks before the end of the war in Europe, Bonhoeffer is moved to a concentration camp. There, after a sham trial, he is sentenced to death. And on April 9th, 1945, Bonhoeffer was executed by hanging. His last words, "This is the end. For me, the beginning of life." It was like he was staring death in the face and saying, "Is that all you got?" The camp doctor who witnessed Bonhoeffer's execution, he later said, "I saw Pastor Bonhoeffer kneeling on the floor, praying fervently to God. I was most deeply moved by the way this devout man prayed. He was so devout and so certain God heard his prayer. At the place of execution, he again said a short prayer. He climbed the few steps to the gallows, brave and composed. His death ensued after a few seconds, and in the almost 50 years that I worked as a doctor, I have hardly ever seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God." And it was a tragic end to a remarkable life, but as we'll see, it was far from the end of Bonhoeffer's influences. Bonhoeffer's life and writings have had a profound impact on Christian theology and ethics. His concepts of religionless Christianity and The World Come of Age have challenged believers to rethink what does it mean to follow Christ in the modern world. Bonhoeffer has forced us to look in the mirror and ask some really hard questions. His book, The Cost of Discipleship, with its concept of cheap grace versus costly grace, has become a classic of Christian literature. It's like he was saying, hey, following Jesus, it's not a spectator sport. It's going to cost you something. But perhaps Bonhoeffer's greatest legacy is his example of moral courage in the face of evil. He lived them out, even when it cost him everything. He looked at the Sermon on the Mount and saw that as a personal challenge. Now, you might be thinking, Bonhoeffer kind of sounds too good to be true. And you'd be right to be skeptical, because like any good hero, Bonhoeffer, he had his flaws. He could be stubborn, sometimes arrogant, and his decision to return to Germany, it has been criticized by some as naive or even reckless. But that's what makes Bonhoeffer so fascinating. He wasn't just some theologian. He's not just some saint. He's a real person who wrestled with real dilemmas, made real mistakes, and somehow through it all, he changed the course of Christian history. And so as we close the book on Bonhoeffer's life, we're left with some interesting questions. What would Bonhoeffer's theology have looked like if he had survived the war? How would he have responded to the challenges of the post-war world? And maybe most intriguingly, what would Bonhoeffer think of our modern ethical dilemmas? Was Bonhoeffer right to abandon pacifism and join the plot against Hitler? Can we justify violence in the pursuit of justice? These are challenging questions that we have to continue to answer today. And so Bonhoeffer's life, it poses a challenge to all of us. In a world that often seems to be sliding into chaos and injustice, how will we respond? Will we have the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs us everything? Are we comfortable to rethink our theologies when they no longer speak to the realities of our world? Because in the end, Bonhoeffer's story isn't history alone. It's a call to action. It's like he's reaching out from the past. He's grabbing us by the collar and saying, what are you going to do about the injustice of your time?